Picture this claustrophobic nightmare. You're crawling on your hands and knees through a pitch-black sewer tunnel carved beneath Nottingham Castle. The stone walls press against your shoulders. The air is thick with the stench of human waste and damp rock. It is October 19th, 1330. You're not leading a royal procession. You're leading a hit squad of 24 armed men. You're 17 years old and you are King Edward III of England. But tonight, stripped of crown and ceremony, you're a fugitive infiltrating your own fortress. Your mission is absolutely insane. Infiltrate the Queen's bedroom, kill her guards, and kidnap the dictator currently sleeping in her bed. One slip, one noise, one guard looking the wrong direction, and you will be executed for treason against your own crown. This is the moment childhood ends forever. This is the moment a terrified boy transforms into a butcher to save his kingdom. The darkness ahead is total. The tunnel stretches endlessly. Your heart hammers against your ribs. You can hear your men breathing behind you, the scrape of swords against stone. Somewhere above, your mother sleeps in silk sheets next to the man who murdered your father. How did the anointed King of England end up crawling through sewage to steal back his own throne? Before we dive into this story of survival, betrayal, and the birth of a nation, smash that like button and subscribe to Map-Room Battles for more forgotten stories that challenge what you think you know about history. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's incredible. We're exploring medieval England together across centuries and continents, connected by our shared need to understand how violence shapes power, to understand why a king was hiding in a tunnel breathing sewer air. You need to understand the target of his blade, Roger Mortimer. For 3 suffocating years, this Welsh marcher lord had held England in a stranglehold. He was the lover of Edward's mother, Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France. Together, they had invaded England in 1326, deposed Edward's father Edward II in a coup, and if the terrible screams heard from Berkeley Castle were real, murdered him with a red-hot poker shoved up his anus. They placed young Edward on the throne at 14 as a puppet king. Mortimer pulled every string. He seized the estates of his political rivals without trial. He mocked the ancient nobility to their faces. He even tricked the king's uncle, the Earl of Kent, into a trap and publicly beheaded him while Edward watched, powerless to intervene. Mortimer was not just a regent governing during minority. He was a parasite, eating the monarchy alive from within. He believed the boy king was too frightened, too weak, too controlled by his mother to ever fight back. He was catastrophically wrong. Edward had been watching, learning, waiting. He gathered a suicide squad of 24 absolutely loyal men, knights who were willing to die for him. They didn't have an army to challenge Mortimer openly, so they used intelligence instead of force. William Eland, the castle constable, secretly revealed to Edward the existence of a hidden passage cut into the sandstone rock, a sally port meant for emergency escapes. Now, the only way in past Mortimer's guards. They moved fast under cover of darkness. They entered the tunnel entrance outside the castle walls. They ascended the winding staircase through the living bedrock, bypassing the locked gates and the sleeping garrison above. They burst out suddenly into the castle pantry, swords drawn, the clatter of steel shattering the midnight silence. They stormed down the hallway leading to the Queen's private chamber. Mortimer's household knights blocked the heavy oak door, drawing weapons. The clash was brief and absolutely brutal, steel on steel in the narrow corridor, men falling. Edward's men cut the guards down without mercy and kicked the reinforced doors off their iron hinges. Inside, chaos erupted. Mortimer scrambled desperately for his sword. Queen Isabella, realizing what was happening, threw herself physically into the fray, standing between her son's blade and her lover's throat. She screamed the now infamous words that would echo through English history. "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer." Edward ignored her completely. He did not want pity. He wanted his kingdom back. They dragged Mortimer out of the room in chains, leaving the Queen wailing on the floor. The coup was over in 15 minutes. The psychological shift was permanent. Edward had not just arrested a traitor. He had destroyed the maternal bond that had held him captive. The aftermath was swift and merciless as a headsman's axe. Edward hauled Mortimer in chains to London. There was no formal trial, with lawyers and witnesses. The assembled peers of the realm men who had suffered under Mortimer's tyranny condemned him directly to the traitor's death. They hanged him publicly at Tyburn on November 29th, 1330, leaving his corpse to rot on the gallows for 2 full days and nights as carrion for crows. It was a gruesome message, carved in flesh, to every lord in England. The puppet strings are cut. The lion is awake. Don't test him. Isabella was stripped of her vast landed estates and exiled to comfortable imprisonment at Castle Rising in Norfolk. She would live out her remaining days in luxury, but politically dead, a ghost haunting the margins of history. Edward stood alone at the top of the feudal hierarchy for the first time in his life, but he had inherited a profoundly broken realm. The royal treasury was empty, drained by Mortimer's corruption. The Scots were raiding the northern borders with impunity, laughing at English weakness. The nobility remained fractured and suspicious, waiting to see if this 17-year-old was just another tyrant or something genuinely different. Edward knew instinctively that he needed more than a midnight raid to prove himself. He needed to forge a new reputation in the fires of war. He turned his calculating eyes north, toward the Scottish border, where he would trade his assassin's dagger for a general's sword. With Mortimer dead and his mother exiled, Edward stood at the helm of a ship that was rapidly taking on water. He was 18 years old. In the eyes of his wary subjects, he was an unknown quantity, unproven. Worse, he bore the cursed name Edward. To the English nobility, that name had become synonymous with catastrophe and humiliation. His father, Edward II, had been a walking disaster for the Plantagenet dynasty. He had famously lost the crown jewels in a bog during a military campaign. He had lost the great English army at Bannockburn to Robert the Bruce and the Scots. He had lost the respect of his barons by elevating low-born favorites Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser to positions of power based on personal affection rather than merit. The shadow of Edward II hung over the royal court like a suffocating fog. Every time the young king spoke, every time he issued a command, the earls watched him closely, searching for telltale signs of his father's weakness or his mother's treachery. Edward faced a complex psychological paradox. To rule legitimately, he had to publicly honor his father's memory and punish his murderers. Yet to rule effectively, he had to be the complete opposite of the man his father had been. He had to perform a delicate act of political exorcism, honoring the crown while rejecting the man who wore it. He began by carefully rewriting the narrative. He staged a magnificent, solemn reburial for his father at Gloucester Cathedral. He commissioned an elaborate alabaster tomb, transforming the burial site into a pilgrimage shrine for a royal martyr. This was a masterstroke of propaganda. By publicly canonizing his father as a victim of treasonous murder, he washed away the embarrassing memory of the incompetents. He turned a failed king into a holy ancestor whose death demanded vengeance. But stone monuments do not govern kingdoms or command armies. Edward knew he desperately needed to win the hearts of a warrior aristocracy that had grown idle, rebellious, and cynical under weak leadership. He needed to speak their language fluently, and in the 14th century, that language was chivalry, the cult of knightly honor, martial prowess, and ritualized violence. Under Edward's personal direction, the English royal court underwent a radical transformation. The gloom and suspicion of the previous reign vanished overnight, replaced by a riot of color, noise, and celebration. He threw open the royal treasury, what little remained of it after Mortimer's theft, to fund grand tournaments. These were not merely sporting events or entertainment. They were sophisticated engines of political propaganda. Imagine the scene at Cheapside or Smithfield in London. Wooden stands packed with thousands of shouting spectators, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and horse sweat. Banners snapping in the wind, displaying the golden lions of England. Knights from across the realm, men who had previously plotted against the crown. Men who had served Mortimer now rode beneath the king's direct gaze, competing desperately for his favor and recognition. Edward did not sit passively in the royal box, watching politely like a mere spectator. He rode into the tournament lists himself. He dressed as a simple knight, his royal identity deliberately concealed by a full helm. Or sometimes he appeared costumed as a mythical figure, like Sir Lancelot from Arthurian romance. He shattered lances against his own earls in the violent impact of the joust. He took hits that knocked him from his horse. He bled. This was visceral, physical leadership. The barons saw with their own eyes a king who could take a blow and stay in the saddle. They saw a man who understood the brutal weight of armor and the practical mechanics of violence. This physical competence earned him a currency that gold alone could never buy: respect. He was signaling clearly to every man with a sword in England that the days of royal favorites and effeminate court politics were definitively over. The Plantagenet wolf had returned to the throne. Alongside this martial rebranding, Edward secured the royal succession with ruthless efficiency. His wife, Philippa of Hainault, proved to be the perfect royal consort. She was fertile, producing heirs regularly. She was kind and beloved by the common people. She was politically astute, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. In June 1330, just months before the Nottingham coup, she gave birth to a healthy son, Edward of Woodstock, later known to history and legend as the Black Prince. The arrival of a male heir so early in Edward's reign dramatically stabilized the shaky throne. It told the world, told rival claimants, foreign kings, rebellious barons that this was not a temporary interregnum. This was a dynasty digging in its heels for generations. However, beneath the pageantry of tournaments and the joy of christenings, a festering wound remained in the body politic: the North. The shameful Treaty of Northampton, signed by Mortimer during Edward's powerless minority, had officially recognized Robert the Bruce as the independent King of Scotland. It had formally renounced all English claims to feudal lordship over the northern neighbor. For the English barons who had lost their ancestral lands in Scotland during the wars, this was an unforgivable betrayal. For Edward personally, it was an insult that burned. The Scots, sensing the internal chaos and weakness in England, had grown dangerously bold. They raided the borderlands with impunity, burning English villages and stealing livestock. The buffer zone between the two nations became a lawless hellscape where neither king's law applied. Edward looked at the parchment of the peace treaty, bearing his own royal seal, forced upon him by Mortimer, and decided it was worth less than the ink used to sign it. Fate offered him a perfect pretext for war. The great Robert the Bruce died in 1329, leaving his 5-year-old son, David II, on the Scottish throne. Scotland now faced the exact same vulnerability that had nearly destroyed England: a child king with regents fighting for power. Edward saw the symmetry immediately. He saw the golden opportunity. He quietly began to support financially a group of disenfranchised Scottish nobles known as the Disinherited Men, who had lost their Scottish lands to Bruce's redistribution and were desperate to reclaim them by force. Edward didn't declare war openly. At first, that would technically break the treaty. Instead, he let these warlords launch a private invasion from English ships, watching carefully from the shadows to see what would happen. When this ragtag private army achieved a shocking victory against the Scots at Duplin Moor, Edward knew the time for pretense was over. The Scottish Guardians mobilized a massive force to crush the English-backed invaders. They called desperately on the French for military support. Edward threw off the diplomatic mask. He publicly accused the Scots of border violations. He moved the entire royal court to York, transforming the northern city into a militarized capital. The tournament stopped abruptly. The ceremonial lances were replaced with real, sharpened weapons. The king rode north at the head of an army, not to negotiate, but to conquer. He was about to walk onto a battlefield that would change military history forever, testing a revolutionary new tactical formation that would eventually destroy the flower of French chivalry at Crécy. But first, it would have to be proven in the mud and blood of Halidon Hill. By the summer of 1333, the diplomatic niceties were completely over. Edward III marched a professional army north to besiege the vital border fortress town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. He was done with treaties and compromises. He wanted a decisive fight, and the Scots, led by their guardian of the realm, Sir Archibald Douglas, obliged him. They marched a massive relief force to break the English siege, heavily outnumbering Edward's forces. Edward did not panic and run. He did not order a reckless charge. He did something that defied the conventional wisdom of feudal warfare. He stopped advancing. He carefully positioned his army on the slopes of Halidon Hill, a rising crest of land overlooking a treacherous boggy marsh. Then he issued a command that sent a shockwave through the aristocratic ranks. He ordered his knights, the proudest warriors in Christendom, men who defined their identity by mounted combat, to dismount from their expensive war horses. This was a radical psychological gambit that challenged the entire social order. In the 14th century, a knight without a horse was considered diminished, less than noble, almost common. But Edward dismounted with them personally. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his men in the mud, deliberately cutting off his own escape route. The message was absolute and clear. We win together, or we die together on this hill. There is no retreat. He organized his defensive line into 3 solid blocks of dismounted men-at-arms in full plate armor. But the real tactical innovation lay on the flanks. Projecting out from the solid infantry lines like wings, he positioned large formations of archers in a distinctive harrow or wedge formation, jagged triangles of men pointing aggressively toward the enemy. These were not the ragtag peasant archers of previous centuries, drafted from villages and given a bow. These were hardened professionals wielding the English warbow, the weapon that would dominate European battlefields for a century. Understand the brutal mechanics of this weapon. A warbow was a piece of seasoned yew wood as tall as a grown man, with a draw weight of up to 150 pounds. Pulling it back to full draw required the physical strength of a modern weightlifter. English archers were conditioned from childhood boys, as young as 7, practicing daily until their skeletons themselves visibly deformed under the stress, creating distinctive bone growths archaeologists can still identify today. The weapon fired a bodkin arrow, a heavy, chisel-tipped missile designed not to cut like a blade, but to punch through armor like a nail through tin. At close range, it could smash through chainmail and even plate armor, the momentum creating devastating internal injuries. Sir Archibald Douglas looked up from the marsh at the English position. He saw a smaller army. He saw knights standing shamefully on foot. He assumed fundamental weakness. He confidently ordered the Scottish army to charge. To reach the English lines, the Scots had to descend from their own hill and cross the sodden marsh at the bottom of the valley. As thousands of men waded into the muck, their momentum immediately died. They bunched together in confusion, struggling in knee-deep slime. Then the sky above them turned black. The English archers loosed their first massed volley. Thousands of arrows hissed through the air simultaneously, creating a rhythmic, terrifying drumming sound as they struck flesh, wood, and metal. The Scots were not fighting an enemy army. They were walking into what we would recognize as a machine gun nest. The arrows didn't just kill cleanly. They pinned men together. They shattered wooden shields. They pierced iron helmets. They killed horses that screamed and thrashed. The Scottish formation, The dreaded schiltron of massed spears that had defeated English armies before dissolved into a screaming, chaotic mass of dying men. Those who survived the horrific storm of arrows crawled desperately up the hill, exhausted and psychologically broken, only to be met by the fresh, rested wall of English men-at-arms who cut them down with swords and axes. It wasn't a battle. It was an industrial execution. The Chronicle of Lanercost records the scale of the butchery. The Scots fell so thick that it seemed as if one lay upon another like a carpet of bodies. Douglas was killed. 5 Scottish earls were killed. The flower of Scottish nobility was mulched into the bloody grass of Halidon Hill. Edward watched the carnage unfold with cold, calculating detachment. He did not offer chivalrous ransom for noble prisoners. He did not show the traditional mercy expected of a Christian king. He ordered a pursuit that lasted for miles, systematically hunting down the survivors and killing them. When the sun finally set, thousands of Scots lay dead in the marsh and on the hillside. The English losses were almost negligible, perhaps fewer than 20 men killed. Halidon Hill was the proof of concept Edward needed. He had discovered the tactical trinity that would define his entire military legacy: advantageous terrain, dismounted heavy cavalry fighting as infantry, and massed professional archery. He had turned the borderlands into a military laboratory. He had tested his hypothesis on the Scots, and the result was total, devastating success. But as he surveyed the piled bodies being looted by his soldiers, Edward realized something crucial. This military machine he'd built was too expensive, too powerful, too efficient to be used solely for border disputes with Scotland. He had built a Ferrari of medieval warfare. He couldn't just use it for grocery runs. His ambition rapidly outgrew the narrow confines of Britain. Across the English Channel, the Kingdom of France, the wealthiest, most populous realm in all of Europe, loomed large. The French king, Philip VI, had been actively meddling in Scottish affairs, funding the resistance against English overlordship and publicly insulting Edward's honor. Edward looked at his longbowmen wiping Scottish blood from their arrows. He looked at his knights, hardened by recent slaughter and hungry for more. He realized with growing excitement that he had the military means to do the impossible. He would claim the crown of France itself. The laboratory phase was over. The Great War was about to begin. By 1337, Edward III faced a geopolitical dilemma that would define the next century of European history. He had perfected the weapon, the longbow, combined with dismounted cavalry, but he needed a target worthy of its devastating power. He found his justification in the tangled branches of the royal family tree. When Charles IV, King of France, died without a male heir in 1328, the French nobility scrambled desperately to find a suitable successor. They dusted off an ancient, obscure legal code called Salic law, which conveniently forbade inheritance of the crown through the female line. They used this legal gymnastics to block Edward's claim his mother Isabella was Charles's sister, making Edward the closest living male relative. Instead, they handed the crown to a more distant cousin, Philip VI of Valois. Edward initially stayed quiet and diplomatic. He was young, barely into his 20s, and his own throne was still shaky after the Mortimer crisis. But Philip VI made a fatal mistake born of arrogance. He treated Edward not as a fellow monarch and equal, but as a disobedient vassal who needed to be controlled. Philip confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine, England's last valuable foothold on the continent, and a massive source of wine revenue that filled English coffers. He threatened to destroy the wool trade with Flanders, the economic engine that turned English raw wool into gold coin through Flemish weavers. Philip was systematically squeezing Edward's economic throat. Edward responded by punching him in the face. In a moment of supreme arrogance and calculated political theater, Edward formally declared himself the rightful king of France. He quartered his royal coat of arms, stitching the golden fleurs-de-lis of France directly next to the lions of England. This was not just a diplomatic protest or negotiating position. It was a declaration of total war. It turned every French noble loyal to Philip into a traitor to Edward's rightful rule. Legend tells of the Vow of the Heron, a dramatic banquet where Robert of Artois, a French exile seeking revenge, served Edward a roasted heron, a bird symbolically known for cowardice, daring him to take what was rightfully his. Whether the story is true or medieval folklore, the sentiment was absolutely real. Edward mortgaged the English crown jewels to Italian bankers. He borrowed astronomical sums that nearly bankrupted the realm. He sailed for Flanders to directly confront the usurper Philip. But Philip was waiting with a massive military response. On June 24th, 1340, Edward's invasion fleet approached the estuary at Sluys in Flanders. What he saw on the horizon would have terrified a lesser man into retreat. A massive French armada of over 200 ships formed a solid wall across the inlet. It was a floating fortress, a forest of masts so dense that the wooden hulls were physically chained together to create a seamless battlefield on the waves. Edward had fewer ships and was outnumbered. His senior advisors desperately begged him to retreat and find another landing. Edward looked at them and said coldly, "I shall cross, and those who are afraid may stay at home." He ordered his fleet to maneuver carefully. He waited patiently for the tide and the wind to turn in his favor, positioning his ships so the sun would be behind his archers, blinding the enemy. Then he crashed directly into the French line. Forget the cinematic naval battles of cannon fire and billowing sails you see in movies. Sluys was a brutal, claustrophobic street fight on rocking wooden platforms. The English ships grappled the French vessels with iron hooks. Heavy planks were thrown violently across the gaps between hulls. Then the archers opened fire from elevated positions. From the high wooden castles built on the English ships' decks, the longbowmen rained death down onto the packed French decks below. The French crossbowmen, slower to reload and fatally outranged, were suppressed instantly in the first minutes. It was a slaughterhouse. With the enemy decks cleared by the arrow storm, the English men-at-arms boarded with axes and swords swinging. There was absolutely no retreat possible. If you were pushed backward, you fell into the sea. And in the 14th century, falling into water while wearing 40 pounds of mail and plate armor meant only one thing: you drowned helplessly. The water of the harbor turned purple-red with blood. The panic on the French ships was absolute and contagious. Sailors jumped overboard desperately to escape the English blades, only to be dragged down immediately by their armor, or finished off by English soldiers in small boats below. Contemporary chronicles record grimly that if the fish in Sluys harbor could speak, they would speak French, for they feasted on so many French sailors that day. Edward himself was in the thick of the fighting, bleeding from the front. He took a wound accounts vary between his thigh and his arm, but he kept fighting, sword in hand. This was the warrior king brand in action, carefully cultivated. He wasn't directing the battle safely from a map room. He was bleeding on the deck alongside common soldiers. By the time the sun set over the carnage, the French Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Chronicles estimate 19,000 French sailors and soldiers were killed. England had seized total, undisputed command of the English Channel. For the next 30 years, no French fleet would dare seriously threaten the English coast. Edward wrote home triumphantly to his son, the young Edward of Woodstock, announcing the victory as divine judgment. He had proved his claim to France was righteous through the medieval ordeal of combat. But as the adrenaline faded and reality set in, a darker truth emerged. The glorious victory at Sluys, while psychologically devastating to France, yielded absolutely no land. Edward was now a king with 2 claimed crowns, a destroyed enemy navy, and a debt mountain so catastrophically high it threatened to bury his entire government. He couldn't pay his soldiers their promised wages. He couldn't pay his Italian bankers their interest. The victory rang hollow. He returned to London not to a triumphant celebration, but to a financial crisis. He furiously sacked his ministers, threw corrupt judges in prison, and raged publicly against the crippling cost of military glory. He realized with frustration that destroying an enemy fleet, while satisfying, was not strategically enough. To truly break France and make his claims stick, he couldn't just fight on the coastal edges. He had to strike inland at the heart. He had to march deep into France, burn the countryside, destroy the tax base, and force Philip to face him on open ground in a decisive battle. He needed another Halidon Hill, but on a continental scale. He needed what would become the Battle of Crécy. 6 long years after Sluys, Edward was back on French soil with a vengeance. But this time, he wasn't looking for a naval brawl or a siege. He was executing a military strategy of calculated terror, known as the chevauchée, the destructive mounted raid. The plan was brutally simple and psychologically devastating. Burn everything of value. Edward's army marched through Normandy like a plague of armored locusts. They systematically torched villages, destroyed standing crops, and looted monasteries of their treasures. This wasn't mindless vandalism by undisciplined soldiers. It was economic warfare, carefully designed to destroy the French tax base and publicly humiliate King Philip VI. Every burning barn was a smoke signal visible for miles, asking the French king a humiliating question: where are you? Why can't you protect your own people? Philip took the bait. His honor stung. He raised the oriflamme, the sacred red banner of Saint Denis, that signaled no quarter would be given, no prisoners taken. He gathered a colossal army, perhaps 3 times the size of Edward's force, and chased the English across northern France. By August 26, 1346, Edward was strategically cornered near the Somme River. He was dangerously low on supplies. His men were tired from weeks of marching and burning. The French Leviathan was breathing down his neck, getting closer. He desperately needed a defensible place to make his stand. He chose a small hillside near an obscure village called Crécy-en-Poitiers. Edward immediately reverted to the proven playbook from Halidon Hill. He ordered his aristocratic knights to dismount from their war horses. He ordered his men to dig concealed pits to break enemy cavalry charges. And on both flanks of his defensive position, he deployed thousands of longbowmen in that deadly sawtooth harrow formation that had butchered the Scots. Then, he did something that shocked the entire army. He gave command of the vanguard, the most dangerous, exposed position, to his 16-year-old son, Edward of Woodstock, later called the Black Prince. The French army arrived in the late afternoon, a chaotic, glittering mess of feudal arrogance. Philip VI, showing rare wisdom, wanted to wait until morning to attack in good order, but his nobles, seeing the apparently small English army trapped, completely ignored his commands. They were drunk on anticipated glory. They pushed forward eagerly, creating a massive traffic jam of horses and steel. Then nature intervened. The sky opened up with a sudden, violent thunderstorm that soaked the battlefield in minutes. The French had hired elite Genoese crossbowmen, considered the best professional soldiers in Europe, to soften up the English position. But their crossbow strings, made of organic sinew, slackened dangerously in the heavy rain, losing tension and power. The English archers, seasoned professionals who knew their craft, had simply removed their bowstrings and tucked them safely under their helmets to keep them dry. When the sun came back out after the storm, shining directly into the eyes of the advancing French, the Genoese fired a weak, ineffective volley that fell short. Edward gave the signal. The English archers calmly stepped forward in formation. They didn't just fire arrows, they unleashed an industrial blizzard of death. Contemporaries described the arrows flying so thick and fast they looked like falling snow. The Genoese mercenaries were cut to ribbons in minutes, hundreds falling. Panicked, the survivors tried desperately to retreat back to their own lines. This is where French chivalry committed suicide. seeing their own hired mercenaries retreating in disorder. The French knights, blinded by aristocratic class hatred and overwhelming bloodlust, charged directly through them. They deliberately trampled their own allies into the mud to get at the English. It was magnificent, suicidal madness. As the French knights in their heavy armor lumbered up the wet, muddy slope, they faced the full kinetic energy of thousands of English warbows firing in rotation. Horses were maddened by arrows piercing their flesh. Knights were pinned to the ground by bodkin points. The pile of bodies, men and horses tangled together, grew so high it literally became a physical wall blocking the next wave of the charge. In the chaotic melee, the young Black Prince was nearly overwhelmed by French knights who recognized his distinctive armor. A desperate messenger raced to King Edward, who was watching the battle from a windmill on the ridge, begging for immediate reinforcements to save the prince. Edward asked a simple, cold question. "Is my son dead, or unhorsed, or so badly wounded he cannot fight?" "No, sire," the messenger replied breathlessly. "Then go back," Edward said flatly, "and tell them not to send for me again as long as my son lives. Let the boy win his spurs." It was a calculated Spartan gamble with his dynasty's future. Edward was betting everything, his heir, his legacy, on his teenage son's survival in brutal hand-to-hand combat, and the boy delivered. The Black Prince fought like a demon possessed, holding the critical line against the best warriors of France. By midnight, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. The French army was annihilated. Philip VI had fled the field with a wounded jaw, humiliated. Thousands of French nobles, the cream of French chivalry, lay dead in the purple mud. Among the fallen was the blind King John of Bohemia, who had asked his knights to tie their horses' reins to his, so he could strike at least one blow in battle, despite his blindness. They found him the next day dead, still tethered to his loyal guards' corpses. He became a tragic symbol of the old romantic chivalry dying forever at the hands of cold English efficiency. Crécy changed everything about European warfare. It proved definitively that a disciplined army of peasant archers could utterly destroy the feudal elite in their expensive armor. The English didn't just win a battle, they overturned the entire social order of medieval Europe. Edward III was no longer just a king defending his inheritance. He was the acknowledged master of the battlefield, but he knew instinctively that to maintain a permanent foothold in France, he needed more than fields full of corpses. He needed a strategic door, a permanent base. He needed the fortified port city of Calais. And if Crécy was a sudden, shocking slaughter, the siege of Calais would be a slow, agonizing starvation that would test both armies' endurance. After the adrenaline high of Crécy's one-day massacre, the war ground to a sickening, frustrating halt. Edward marched his victorious army north to the heavily fortified coastal fortress of Calais. He didn't want another field battle at this point. He wanted a strategic door, a permanent gateway for English wool exports and English armies into France. But Calais was nearly impregnable. It was built on an artificial island of reclaimed marshes, surrounded by double stone walls and moats, fed directly by the sea. It was essentially unbreakable by direct assault, so Edward decided to strangle it slowly. He ordered his army to dig in for a long siege. This wasn't a temporary military camp. Edward built an entire functioning wooden city outside the walls of Calais, complete with a bustling marketplace, a council chamber for governance, and even paved streets. He grandly named it Villeneuve-la-Hardy, Newtown the Bold. It was a sophisticated psychological weapon, a wooden middle finger raised at the French defenders. It told them clearly, "I am not leaving until you are dead or in chains. Get comfortable." The siege of Calais became a grim, medieval contest of endurance. Inside the walls, the French governor, Jean de Vienne, quickly realized the food supplies were running catastrophically low. In a desperate, brutal bid to save rations for his soldiers, he rounded up the useless mouths, the elderly, the sick, women, and children who couldn't fight. and expelled them forcibly from the city gates. History gives us conflicting accounts of what happened next, but the darkest version likely paints the truest picture of medieval warfare's cruelty. These hundreds of desperate civilians were trapped in the freezing no-man's land between the French walls and the English siege trenches. They cried out desperately for mercy from both sides. They starved to death slowly in full view of both armies, their bodies left to rot. Edward watched them die without intervention. To him, they were not innocent people deserving pity. They were weapons of the enemy, consuming resources he wanted to capture intact. This was the ruthless warlord stripping away all romantic veneer to reveal war's skeletal truth. For 11 grinding months, the siege dragged on. The French King Philip VI finally marched a relief army to the horizon within sight of Calais. He looked at Edward's heavily entrenched position. He looked at the English fleet blockading the harbor. He calculated the odds and decided it was too risky. He turned around and marched his entire army home, abandoning his loyal subjects to their inevitable fate. When the starving defenders of Calais saw their own king's banners retreating over the horizon, their spirit broke completely. They signaled surrender. Edward was furious at the delay and cost. The siege had drained his treasury and tied down his army for nearly a year. He demanded unconditional surrender. He wanted to sack the city completely and slaughter every living soul as an example. His senior advisors, however, warned him that such visible cruelty would make future French cities fight to the death rather than surrender. Edward compromised with a chilling piece of political theater. He announced publicly that he would spare the city if 6 of its wealthiest, most prominent citizens, the burghers, walked out of the gates barefoot, wearing only their shirts with heavy ropes tied around their necks, carrying the keys to the city. They were to present themselves for public execution. It was designed to be a humiliation. 6 men volunteered immediately to save their neighbors. They walked the gauntlet through the English army, emaciated from months of starvation and humiliated, offering their lives. When they knelt before Edward, the king coldly ordered the headsman to step forward. He was genuinely going to kill them, but then an unexpected figure stepped between the king and his victims. Queen Philippa, heavily pregnant with another child, fell to her knees before her husband. She wept and pleaded, "Ah, gentle sire, since I have crossed the sea with great danger to see you, I have never asked you for anything. Now I humbly pray, for the sake of the Son of the Holy Mary, and for your love of me, that you will have mercy on these 6 men." The tension was absolutely palpable. Edward stared at the ropes around the men's necks. He stared at his weeping, pregnant wife. To kill them would make him a monster in the eyes of the church and chroniclers. To spare them might show weakness. Or perhaps, and many historians suspect this, it was a carefully choreographed performance of good cop, bad cop, allowing the king to be the terrifying sword, while the queen played the merciful sheath. Edward sighed dramatically. "Lady, I wish you were anywhere else but here," he grumbled, "but I cannot refuse you." He cut the ropes personally. The burghers were fed, clothed in proper garments, and sent away free with safe conduct. Calais was now English. It would remain an English colony for over 200 years, a permanent Little England on French soil. With the conquest complete, Edward returned to England in 1348 as an undisputed hero. The shame and humiliation of his father's reign were completely erased. The treasury was filling up with French loot and ransom money. To cement this new golden age and bind his fractious nobility together, Edward founded an elite brotherhood of knights, the Order of the Garter. Forget the silly Victorian myth about the Countess of Salisbury dropping her garter at a dance and the king gallantly picking it up to stop courtiers from snickering. That is a completely fabricated fairy tale. The reality was far more pragmatic and political. Edward desperately needed a way to bind his most powerful commanders, men like the Black Prince, the Earl of Lancaster, and his top earls, to his personal will through ceremony and honor. He consciously modeled the order on King Arthur's legendary Round Table. It was a genius stroke of internal politics. By limiting membership to just 26 knights, Edward, the Prince of Wales, and 24 companions, he created a frenzy of competition among the nobility. Every lord in England desperately wanted that blue garter strapped below his knee. It became the ultimate status symbol, more valuable than land. The motto Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, was a direct challenge to any critic of Edward's claim to the French throne. Windsor Castle was massively remodeled to host their elaborate feasts. They jousted in tournaments. They prayed together in St. George's Chapel. They swore binding oaths of brotherhood. Edward had successfully weaponized aristocratic vanity. He had united his fractious, competitive nobility into a single loyal fist pointed at France. By the summer of 1348, Edward III stood at the summit of the medieval world. He was the undefeated warlord, the master of chivalry, the King of England, and claimant to France. The sun was shining brilliantly on the Plantagenet Empire. His treasury was full. His nobles were united. His heir was proven in battle. But on the distant horizon, a different kind of ship was docking at the southern port of Melcombe Regis. It carried no soldiers, no siege weapons, no banners of war. It carried only a few sick sailors and a cargo hold full of black rats. Edward had defeated the Scots at Halidon Hill. He had crushed the French at Crécy. He had conquered Calais. But he was about to face an enemy that no longbow could kill, no castle wall could block, and no royal mercy could soften. The apocalypse was arriving on 4 legs and a flea bite. The victory at Crécy and the capture of Calais had seemed to promise a golden age of English dominance. But in the summer of 1348, the ships returning to England from the continent brought a cargo that would turn that gold into ash. It entered through the southern ports, carried invisibly in the blood of black rats and the bellies of their fleas. They called it the Great Mortality. We know it as the Black Death. It moved with terrifying, unstoppable speed. One day, a man would feel a sudden chill and weakness. Then hard, painful lumps, called buboes, would swell in his groin or armpits, turning black and oozing pus. High fever would rage, delirium would set in, and within 3 days, he was dead. The disease was efficient, merciless, and utterly indiscriminate. It did not spare the peasant's cottage, and it did not spare the king's castle. Edward III, the great protector of his realm, found himself completely powerless against this invisible enemy. He sent his favorite daughter, Princess Joan, to Spain to marry into the Castilian royal family, a diplomatic alliance designed to isolate France. She never made it to the wedding. She died of the plague in Bordeaux at just 14 years old. Edward was absolutely devastated. In a letter to the King of Castile, the usually stoic warrior wrote with raw human grief, "We have sent your majesty, our dearest daughter, but she has been taken from us by God. No fellow human creature could be loved more by us. The man who could order the slaughter of thousands on a battlefield without flinching was brought to his knees by an invisible microbe." By the time the first wave of plague subsided in 1350, nearly half of the entire population of England was dead. The silence in the villages was deafening and eerie. Entire communities were wiped completely off the map. The fields were overgrown with weeds. The cattle wandered wild with no one to tend them. The churchyards were overflowing with hastily dug graves. But for the survivors of this apocalypse, something unexpected happened. A strange, paradoxical economic miracle emerged from the mass graves. For centuries, the feudal system had been a rigid pyramid of exploitation. The peasants formed the base, numerous, cheap, easily replaceable, crushed under the weight of the lords and clergy. But suddenly, catastrophically, the base of the pyramid had vanished. there were too few hands to harvest the crops. The laws of supply and demand, older than any king, kicked in with brutal force. A plowman who used to beg desperately for work could now demand double, triple, even quadruple his previous wages. If a lord refused to pay, the peasant would simply walk to the next estate, where a desperate landowner would pay anything to get his wheat harvested before it rotted. For the first time in recorded English history, the balance of economic power shifted dramatically from capital to labor. The English peasant suddenly realized his own worth. He ate better meat. He wore better cloth. He looked his master directly in the eye as an equal. Edward III and his Parliament of landowners looked at this social revolution with absolute horror. They did not see natural market forces at work. They saw greed and disorder. They saw a disruption of what they believed was the divinely ordained social order, where the poor were supposed to serve the rich without question. Edward decided to fight the economy itself, just as he had fought the French. In 1349, he issued the Ordinance of Laborers, followed by the infamous Statute of Laborers in 1351. This was a breathtaking piece of reactionary legislation. It artificially froze wages at pre-plague levels, specifically the low rates of 1,346. It made it a criminal offense for a peasant to ask for more money. It made it a crime for a lord to pay higher wages. It forced every able-bodied man and woman under 60 to work at these fixed rates. It even dictated what food they could eat and what clothes they could wear based on social class. Imagine the government today telling you that despite a massive labor shortage in your field, you are legally forbidden from taking a pay raise, and you must work for the same salary you earned 5 years ago or face imprisonment. Edward unleashed his justices to enforce this law with medieval brutality. Thousands of peasants were fined, publicly branded, or put in the stocks for the crime of asking for fair wages. It was a domestic war waged by the state against the rising standard of living of its own people. But here is the profound irony. Edward lost this war completely. You cannot legislate against mathematics. The lords, desperate to save their harvest from rotting in the fields, secretly paid the higher wages anyway, hiding the payments in their account books as bonuses or gifts. The black market for labor thrived despite the law. The Statute of Laborers didn't actually stop wages from rising, but it did accomplish something else, something far more dangerous for the monarchy. It planted a deep, burning resentment in the hearts of the English common people. They saw the king not as their protector against France, but as the enforcer of a rigged economic system designed to keep them poor. Edward had saved the nobility from bankruptcy, but he had sown the seeds of class hatred that would eventually explode decades later in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Yet amidst this domestic chaos and lingering death, the war with France was not over. It was merely sleeping, waiting for the plague to pass. As the mass graves were finally covered over and the population began to slowly stabilize, the war drums began to beat again across the Channel. The truce was ending, and this time, it wouldn't be the aging Edward leading the charge. It would be his son, the Black Prince, now a grown man in his prime and a predator in his own right, ready to deliver a blow that would make Crécy look like a mere skirmish. By 1356, the immediate horror of the plague had receded enough for the business of war to profitably resume. Edward III, now in his mid-40s and slowing down, began to delegate the heavy lifting of military conquest to his eldest son. Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, was now 26 years old. He was tall, physically imposing, charismatic, and terrifyingly competent in war. While his father was the strategic architect drawing plans, the prince was the sword point executing them. He launched a massive chevauchée deep into central France, systematically looting royal treasures, burning harvests, and effectively bankrupting the French crown through economic destruction. But like his father at Crécy, The prince stayed in enemy territory too long, weighted down by plunder. As he tried to retreat back to English-held Bordeaux with wagons groaning under the weight of stolen gold and silver, a large French army cut him off near the city of Poitiers. The new French king, John II, known as John the Good, was absolutely determined to crush this arrogant English raider who had humiliated France. He brought an army that outnumbered the English by at least 2-1, perhaps more. The prince was strategically trapped with no clear escape route. He was so desperate that he offered to return all the loot unconditionally and sign a 7-year truce just to be allowed to leave France peacefully. King John refused the offer. He smelled English blood. He wanted the prince in chains, paraded through Paris as a trophy. On September 19th, 1356, the prince took up a defensive position on a slope surrounded by thick hedges and tangled vineyards. This broken terrain was his force multiplier, channeling enemy attacks and breaking up their formations. The French had learned, or thought they had learned, from the disaster at Crécy 13 years earlier. They knew that charging mounted knights directly into massed longbows was suicidal, so King John ordered his knights to dismount from their war horses. They cut their long cavalry lances down to shorter infantry spears and prepared to march up the hill on foot as a solid wall of steel. It was a logical, tactical adjustment based on hard lessons, but it failed to account for basic physics and human endurance. Walking uphill in 60 pounds of plate armor, through mud and tangled vines, under a scorching September sun, while being shot at, is absolutely exhausting. By the time the French knights reached the English defensive lines, they were gasping desperately for breath. Their movement slowed. The English archers, positioned safely behind the thick hedges, poured arrows into the exposed flanks of the French columns. They aimed specifically for the unarmored legs and the narrow eye slits in visors. The French formation crumbled into a slow-motion catastrophe of metal and dying bodies. Seeing the French wavering and exhausted, the Black Prince made a decisive, aggressive move. He didn't just hold the defensive line. He ordered a counterattack at exactly the right moment. He personally mounted his reserve cavalry and charged down the hill, slamming into the exhausted French infantry with devastating impact. Simultaneously, a small English cavalry force, led by a Gascon commander, the Captal de Buch, circled around through the vineyards and struck the French rear guard. Total panic swept the French ranks. They broke formation and fled in all directions, all except one man. King John II stood his ground heroically. Surrounded by enemies wielding a heavy battle axe, the French king fought with desperate, doomed courage. His 14-year-old son, Philip, stood loyally beside him, shouting frantic warnings. "Father, to the right! Father, to the left!" It was a scene of tragic heroism that contemporaries remembered, but numbers and exhaustion prevailed. The king was physically overwhelmed by sheer numbers. He surrendered his gauntlet to an English knight, becoming the single most valuable prisoner of war in the history of medieval Christendom. The aftermath was a masterclass in psychological domination and propaganda. The Black Prince brought King John back to London, not in an iron cage as a prisoner, but in a carefully staged gilded procession. The prince deliberately rode a small black pony while dressed simply. Meanwhile, he forced the captive king to ride a magnificent white charger in royal robes. It looked like chivalrous humility and respect for royalty. In reality, it was a sophisticated power move. It signaled clearly that the English were so superior, so confident, they could afford to treat a captive emperor as an honored guest. With their king held hostage in the Tower of London and later moved to the Savoy Palace, France collapsed into complete anarchy. Peasants revolted in the Jacquerie. Unemployed mercenary companies roamed the countryside pillaging. The economy imploded. The French had absolutely no choice but to sue for peace on humiliating terms. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny was finally signed. It was the deal of the century for England, perhaps the greatest diplomatic triumph in English history. Edward III agreed to formally renounce his claim to the French throne, a claim that had always been more of a negotiating chip than a realistic goal. In exchange, King John was ransomed for 3 million gold écus, a sum so astronomically vast it's nearly impossible to calculate in modern currency. It was essentially the GDP of a small nation. More importantly, for long-term strategy, England was granted full sovereignty over nearly a third of France, including the rich provinces of Aquitaine, Poitou, and Calais. These lands were no longer held as fiefs under the French king. They were English soil, owned outright. Edward had done it. He had achieved what his grandfather Edward I could only dream of, and his father Edward II had catastrophically failed to maintain. He was the master of a dual monarchy, flushed with ransom cash, led by a dynasty of proven warrior heroes. The Plantagenet sun was at its absolute zenith. But history teaches us one cruel, inevitable lesson. The higher the climb, the harder and more painful the fall. The Treaty of Bretigny marked the peak of the mountain. From this moment of triumph onward, the path would lead only downward into darkness. The heroes would grow old and sick, the gold would run out, and the seeds of victory would bear bitter, poisonous fruit. The decline would not be a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing rotting from within. History teaches us that heroes should die young at their peak. If Henry V had lived to be 70, we might remember him as a tyrant rather than the glorious victor of Agincourt. Edward III did not have that narrative luck. He committed the ultimate sin for a medieval legend. He lived too long. By the late 1360s, the golden facade of the Plantagenet Empire began to crack visibly. The first devastating blow was deeply personal. In 1369, Queen Philippa died after a long illness. She had been the moral compass of the court, the merciful voice that tempered Edward's rage and cruelty. When she was lowered into her grave at Westminster Abbey, part of Edward's humanity died with her. The grieving, aging king, now drifting slowly into senility, was left vulnerable and isolated. And like a shark sensing blood in the water, a new predatory figure emerged from the shadows of the court. Her name was Alice Poitiers. She was not a noblewoman of high birth or royal connection. She was one of Queen Philippa's ladies-in-waiting young. Intelligent, beautiful, and insatiably greedy, she became the king's mistress. But she was far more dangerous than a mere bedwarmer. As Edward's mind fogged with age and his body weakened from a series of strokes, Alice Poitiers became the gatekeeper to royal power. If you wanted the king to sign a document, you paid Alice. If you wanted a royal pardon for a crime, you bribed Alice. She sat openly in the royal courts of law, brazenly intimidating judges to rule in her favor in property disputes. She draped herself in the late queen's jewelry, parading around court with a shamelessness that scandalized the entire nation. The warrior king was reduced to a doting old fool, manipulated by a woman who saw him as nothing more than a walking ATM. While the court rotted from the inside with corruption, the hard-won empire crumbled from the outside with military defeats. The French had a new king, Charles V the Wise, who was far smarter than his predecessors. He refused to give the English another set-piece battle like Crécy or Poitiers. Instead, he adopted a brilliant strategy of avoidance and attrition, slowly recapturing fortified town after town while the English armies marched around uselessly in the countryside, starving and unpaid. The vast territorial conquests of the Treaty of Bretigny evaporated like morning mist. The ransom money ran out. The taxes remained crushing. The people of England, who had once cheered the victories, now groaned under the unbearable cost of failure. In 1376, the political tension finally exploded in what became known as the Good Parliament. For the first time in English history, The House of Commons, the representatives of the merchants and gentry, flexed their collective muscles against the crown. Led by their elected speaker, Peter de la Mare, they launched a ferocious public attack on the corruption in the royal household. They impeached the king's corrupt ministers on charges of embezzlement. They demanded the banishment of Alice Perrers, publicly calling her a sorceress and a thief. Edward, the man who had once humbled France and captured kings, was now too weak, mentally and physically, to even defend his own household staff. He sat trembling on his throne, watching helplessly as his government was systematically dismantled by the very subjects he ruled. But the cruelest twist of fate was yet to come. While Parliament raged in Westminster, Edward's eldest son, the Black Prince, the hope of the dynasty, lay dying in agony in the palace. The hero of Poitiers, the greatest warrior of his generation, had been ravaged by a mysterious illness, likely dysentery or dropsy, contracted during a brutal campaign in Spain. He was bloated, bedridden, and delirious with pain. On June 8, 1376, the Black Prince died at just 45 years old. The hope of the dynasty, the man groomed for decades to be the greatest king England would ever have, was gone before his father. The emotional blow shattered Edward III completely. He had outlived his beloved friends, his devoted wife, and now his heir, his legacy. He withdrew to Sheen Palace, isolated and mentally broken. The final scene of his life, carefully recorded by contemporary chroniclers, is a portrait of absolute pathos and abandonment. As the king lay on his deathbed in June 1377, unable to speak or recognize faces, his loyal courtiers deserted him. They rushed away to curry favor with the new heir, his 10-year-old grandson Richard. Even the palace servants began openly looting the royal chambers, stripping the valuable curtains and furniture while the king lay dying. And Alice Perrers, the legend says that in his final moments, as Edward gasped desperately for breath, she didn't call for a priest to give last rites. She slipped the valuable rings off his dying fingers one by one and fled the room with her stolen treasure, disappearing into history. The Lion of England died alone, in a stripped, looted room with nothing but a single friar holding a crucifix before his glazing eyes. It was a sordid, lonely end for the man who had once held the kings of Europe in the palm of his hand. But while the man died in ignominy and abandonment, he left behind something far more durable than his failing body. He left a fundamentally transformed nation. He left a new language of power, and he left a chaotic, dangerous political landscape that would consume his descendants in blood for generations. As the marble lid slid over Edward III's tomb in Westminster Abbey, the crown passed to his grandson Richard II. The boy was just 10 years old. He was beautiful, intelligent, cultured, and completely unprepared for the pack of wolves circling the throne. Edward III had committed one final inadvertent act of sabotage against his own dynasty. He had been far too fertile. He left behind not just a vulnerable child king, but a pack of powerful, ambitious adult sons, the uncles of the new king who would compete for power. You may know their names from the Wars of the Roses: John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster; Edmund of Langley, Duke of York; and Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. These men were wealthy, experienced veterans of the French wars. They owned vast estates and commanded private armies. By leaving a child on the throne, surrounded by such powerful, ambitious uncles, Edward had set the perfect stage for a destructive family feud that would tear England apart for the next century. The descendants of his sons, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, would soon turn their swords on each other in the bloody civil war we remember as the Wars of the Roses. The glory of the Plantagenets would eventually drown in their own dynastic blood. But if Edward's political legacy was a ticking time bomb, his cultural legacy became the bedrock upon which modern England stands. Before Edward III, The English aristocracy were essentially French colonizers. They spoke French at court. They dressed in French fashion. They looked to Paris for cultural leadership. Edward fundamentally changed that forever. The 100 Years' War forced a permanent separation. To fight France effectively, Edward had to consciously invent an anti-France identity. He weaponized the English language itself as a tool of nationalism. In 1362, he passed the groundbreaking Statute of Pleading, mandating that all court proceedings be conducted in English, not Norman French. For the first time since the Norman conquest of 1066, nearly 300 years, the king spoke the same tongue as the common peasant. It was during his reign that Geoffrey Chaucer began writing the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, proving conclusively that English could be a language of high art and sophisticated literature, not just peasant speech. Edward also inadvertently created the structural foundation of modern democracy through his constant need for money. Because his wars were so astronomically expensive, Edward was forced to constantly summon Parliament to beg for new taxes. Over 50 years of his reign, this transformed the House of Commons from a rubber-stamp advisory body into a powerful institution that could bargain, petition, and even impeach royal ministers. He traded absolute royal power for cash, and in doing so, he permanently empowered the people's representatives. So how do we judge King Edward III from the perspective of 6.5 centuries? It is tempting to look at his sad, lonely death and see only failure. It is easy to look at the loss of his French conquests within his lifetime and say it was all for nothing, a waste of blood and treasure. But that interpretation misses the fundamental point of his transformative life. Edward III took a broken, humiliated nation, a country that was practically a vassal state of France and a punching bag for Scotland, and turned it into a genuine European superpower. He restored the shattered self-respect of the English people after generations of defeat. He gave them a cohesive national identity, defined by military prowess, resilience, and a distinct culture separate from France. He was absolutely a man of his brutal time, ruthless, coldly ambitious, and often cruel. He starved women and children at Calais. He burned villages across Normandy. He manipulated his own son in battle. He was not a saint by any measure. He was a warlord. But he was precisely the warlord England desperately needed to survive the catastrophic 14th century. He proved that a small island nation could punch far above its weight against continental powers. He proved that a king is not inevitably defined by his father's failures, but by his own iron will to conquer his circumstances. History is an eternal cycle. The empire Edward painstakingly built would fall within a generation, rise again briefly under his great-great-grandson Henry V, and fall again permanently. But the national identity he forged, the very idea of Englishness as distinct from French or European, survived the plague, survived the civil wars, and survives fundamentally intact to this day. Edward III didn't just inherit a kingdom through accident of birth. He actively created a nation through will, violence, and political genius. And perhaps that legacy, the invention of England as we understand it, is worth a few historical sins. Think about the parallels to modern nation building. America's founding fathers were slave owners who built a republic on indigenous genocide, yet their constitutional framework survives. Modern Germany was unified by Bismarck through blood and iron. Israel was built through displacement. Every nation is born in violence and contradiction. Edward forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes brutal men create lasting good despite themselves. The longbow democracy he accidentally created by needing Parliament's money became the foundation of representative government. The English language he promoted became the global lingua franca. The national identity he forged survived to defeat Napoleon, to build an empire, to win 2 world wars. None of this excuses the cruelty, but it explains why history remembers him as great, despite the sins. We can acknowledge both truths simultaneously. He was a ruthless warlord who caused immense suffering, and he was a transformative king who shaped the modern world. The Calais burghers walking to their expected execution, Queen Philippa's intervention, Alice Perer's stealing rings from a dying king. These human moments reveal the contradictions. Medieval people were not simple. They contained multitudes, just as we do. What can we learn from Edward III's trajectory? First, that early trauma can forge greatness. The teenager, crawling through sewage to arrest his mother's lover, powerless and humiliated, became the confident king who reshaped Europe. Adversity doesn't automatically create character, but it can. Second, that military innovation matters as much as bravery. Edward didn't just fight harder, he fought smarter. The tactical revolution of dismounted knights and massed archery changed warfare for a century. Modern militaries still study Crécy as a case study in how technology and tactics trump numbers. Third, that legitimacy is performance. Edward's claim to France was legally questionable at best, but by winning battles and capturing kings, he made it real. Power creates its own legitimacy. Fourth, that even great leaders decline. Edward's last decade, senile, manipulated, watching his conquests evaporate shows that no one escapes time. The question is whether you accomplish enough in your prime to make the decline irrelevant to your legacy. Fifth, that unintended consequences often matter more than intended ones. Edward wanted to conquer France. He failed, but he accidentally created parliamentary democracy and English nationalism. History is shaped as much by what we don't plan as what we do. The Statute of Laborers is particularly instructive for modern policy. Edward tried to use law to override economic reality. It failed completely. You cannot legislate against supply and demand. Modern governments, attempting price controls or wage freezes, face the same mathematical inevitability. The market always wins. The Black Death's impact shows how external shocks, pandemics, climate change, technological disruption reshape society more than political decisions. COVID-19 accelerated remote work and e-commerce, more than decades of gradual change. The plague accelerated the end of feudalism, more than centuries of peasant revolts. Edward's relationship with Parliament teaches that even autocrats need money, and whoever controls money controls power. Modern corporations learn this. Shareholders check CEOs. Citizens check kings through taxes. The power of the purse is the ultimate power. The Order of the Garter shows the genius of exclusivity. By limiting membership, Edward made it more valuable than unlimited honors. Modern luxury brands use the same psychology. Scarcity creates desire. The good cop, bad cop routine with Queen Philippa at Calais is political theater at its finest. Modern leaders still use it. The president, who seems harsh until the more moderate vice president intervenes. It allows one person to make threats while another makes concessions, both serving the same goal. Edward's treatment of captured King John, the humiliating honor, is psychological warfare. Treat your defeated enemy with public respect while everyone knows they're your prisoner. It's more devastating than open cruelty. Modern corporations do this in takeovers, keep the defeated CEO as advisor. Alice Perer's represents how predators exploit the vulnerable. Elder abuse, financial manipulation of declining minds, it's ancient and modern. Every society needs protections for those losing capacity. The Wars of the Roses that followed Edward's death show what happens when succession is unclear and multiple branches have legitimate claims. Yugoslavia's collapse, the Mughal succession wars, Sudan's current crisis. Clear succession rules prevent civil war. Edward's transformation of English from peasant tongue to literary language shows how political necessity drives cultural change. Nation building requires language standardization. Modern nations, from Turkey to Israel to Indonesia, have consciously reformed or revived languages to create national unity. The chevauché strategy, economic warfare through devastation, is ancient and modern. Sherman's march through Georgia, strategic bombing in World War II, sanctions on Russia, destroy the enemy's economic base and they can't fight. Edward understood this 6 centuries before modern economists. The Siege of Calais teaches that patience can achieve what violence cannot. Edward couldn't storm the walls, so he starved them out. Modern sieges, Leningrad, Sarajevo, Grozny, show the same brutal logic. Time is a weapon. The tragedy of dying alone despite past glory is universal. Elderly people abandoned in nursing homes. Celebrities dying broke and forgotten. Howard Hughes. Power and fame don't guarantee dignity at the end. The only insurance is genuine relationships, which Edward sacrificed for ambition. The teenage king becomes the senile old man, becomes the dead legend, becomes the historical judgment. Edward has been reinvented by each generation. Victorian imperialists celebrated him. Modern historians critique him. Medieval scholars contextualize him. We see in historical figures what we need to see. He's a mirror. So what's the final verdict? Edward III was a butcher who became a builder. He killed thousands but created a nation. He was cruel but effective. He failed to hold France but succeeded in defining England. He died abandoned but is remembered as great. History is not a morality play. It's a record of what happened and what it meant. Edward happened. England resulted. The connection is direct. If you've stuck with us through this epic journey from the sewers of Nottingham to the lonely deathbed at Sheen Palace, thank you. You're the reason we resurrect these stories from the past. If you want to understand what happened next, how Edward's powerful sons tore his empire apart in the Wars of the Roses, how his great-great-grandson Henry V briefly recaptured France only to lose it all, how the Tudor dynasty rose from the ashes, make sure you smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Map Room Battles. That story of betrayal, ambition, and blood is even darker than this one. Drop a comment. Would you have crawled through that sewer? Would you have spared the 6 burghers of Calais? Would you have frozen wages after the plague? History is made of choices. What would yours have been? Thanks for watching. The past is never dead. It's not even past. It's in the language you speak, the government that rules you, the identity you claim. Edward III is still here, echoing through everything England became. See you in the next video.